My parents brought my abusive ex and a box full of my past to sabotage my wedding, but I exposed the truth and watched them fall. I never thought my own family could be that cruel, until they showed up at my wedding with a secret box that would change everything forever. My name is Amelia Carter, I'm 29 years old, and I work as a book editor for a small publishing house in downtown Portland. 3 years ago, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I cut off all contact with my parents, Gregory and Linda Carter. It wasn't something I did lightly. My father, a retired businessman who valued reputation above everything else, and my mother, a former teacher who lived through other people's approval, had spent years trying to control every aspect of my life. But the final straw came when they sided with my ex-boyfriend Mason during the worst betrayal of my life. Mason Lee was a freelance photographer who swept into my life when I was 22, and naive enough to mistake intensity for passion. For 4 long years I lived in his carefully constructed world where nothing I did was ever quite right. He had this way of complimenting me and tearing me down in the same breath, telling me I was beautiful but suggesting I'd look better if I lost 10 pounds. Praising my intelligence while implying I was too emotional to think clearly. It was psychological warfare disguised as romance, and I was too inexperienced to recognize the tactics. The discovery of his infidelity came like a sledgehammer to the chest. Not one affair, not 2, but 3 separate women he'd been seeing behind my back for months. I found out through a forwarded text meant for someone else. A graphic message that left no room for misinterpretation. My first instinct was to pack my bags and run as far away as possible. But then my parents intervened with their own agenda. Think about the family reputation, Amelia. My father would lecture me during those awful family meetings where they tag-teamed my resolve. The Carters don't just give up when things get difficult. Mason made a mistake, yes, but he's a good man from a respectable family. His father owns 3 dental practices. As if dental practices somehow justified betrayal. My mother's approach was more insidious, targeting my deepest insecurities with surgical precision. You're 26, dear. You can't keep starting over every time something goes wrong. This might genuinely be your last chance at a real relationship with someone of Mason's caliber. What followed was a relentless campaign of psychological warfare that lasted 8 excruciating months. They deployed every weapon in their arsenal. Financial bribes, guilt trips that would make a Catholic grandmother weep, and emotional manipulation so sophisticated it belonged in a psychology textbook. My father dangled a down payment for a house if I'd work things out with Mason. My mother sobbed dramatically about how divorce ran in families, and she couldn't bear to see me become another statistic. They orchestrated elaborate interventions, bringing in distant relatives to lecture me about the sanctity of relationships. When subtle manipulation failed, they offered to bankroll an expensive couples therapist and a romantic getaway to Europe. Anything. Absolutely anything. To avoid the social mortification of explaining their daughter's singleness to their country club friends. The escape took every ounce of strength I possessed. Leaving Mason required dismantling a life we'd built together. But leaving my parents meant accepting that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had been my greatest source of pain. It took another grueling year of therapy, sleepless nights, and rebuilding my shattered sense of self before I finally walked away from all of them. What came next was a revelation I hadn't expected. Silence could be golden. 3 transformative years passed without their constant criticism echoing in my head, without Mason's gaslighting making me question my own reality. During this period of blessed quiet, I rediscovered who I was beneath all their expectations and demands. I met Daniel at a bookstore cafe, this wonderfully steady veterinarian whose eyes lit up when he talked about helping animals, who listened to my stories without trying to fix me or change me. He treated me like something precious that deserved protection, not something broken that needed constant repair. When Daniel proposed last spring in our favorite hiking spot, with wildflowers blooming around us and no audience except a curious squirrel, I experienced pure joy for the first time in decades. But as our October wedding date crept closer, an unexpected nostalgia began creeping in. Despite the years of toxicity, despite the manipulation and control, they were still my parents. The optimistic part of me, the part that had survived their treatment, whispered dangerous thoughts. Maybe time had softened their edges. Maybe parenthood would trump their need to control. Maybe witnessing their daughter's genuine happiness would finally show them what really mattered. Against Daniel's advice, he'd heard every painful story about them. I decided to send Gregory and Linda an invitation. It was my attempt at forgiveness, my olive branch, my final gesture of hope that we could repair what had been broken. I told myself that surely on their daughter's wedding day, they would put aside their pride and just be happy for me. I should have listened to Daniel. The morning of October 15th arrived crisp and bright, with golden leaves falling outside the venue like confetti. I was getting my makeup done when my maid of honor, Sarah, peeked into the bridal suite with a strange expression on her face. "Amelia," she said carefully, "your parents are here." My heart skipped. After 3 years of silence, they'd actually come. "That's wonderful," I said, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. Do they seem okay?" Sarah hesitated. "Well, they brought someone with them. A tall guy with dark hair, carrying a fancy camera bag." The makeup brush froze halfway to my cheek. "What did you say?" "He introduced himself as Mason something. Said he was an old family friend." The room started spinning. "Mason, here, at my wedding, with my parents." I grabbed Sarah's arm. "What else? What else did you see?" "They're sitting in the back row, and your father is carrying this old wooden box. Looks antique or something. Your mom keeps whispering to the guy, and he keeps nodding like they're planning something." I stared at my reflection in the mirror. 3 years of healing, 3 years of building a new life, and they'd brought the one person who represented everything I'd fought to escape. Why would they bring Mason to my wedding? What could they possibly be planning? Daniel knocked on the door. "Amelia, can I come in?" I told him everything Sarah had just shared. His jaw tightened with each word. "We can have security remove them right now," he said. "Just say the word." But I couldn't. Despite every rational thought in my head screaming danger, some part of me still hoped this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Mason was just coincidentally in town. Maybe my parents really did want to make amends and brought him as a peace offering, a way to show they accepted my past. Let's just get through the ceremony, I decided. If they cause any problems during the reception, then we'll handle it. The wedding ceremony unfolded like a dream I'd been planning for months. Golden autumn light streaming through stained glass windows, my grandmother's vintage lace veil catching the breeze, Daniel's eyes shining with unshed tears of joy as I walked down the aisle. Everything should have been perfect, and in many ways it was. But even in that sacred moment, my attention kept drifting to the back row where 3 figures sat like storm clouds on an otherwise sunny day. Gregory and Linda occupied the corner seats like they were attending a business meeting rather than their daughter's wedding. Mason lounged beside them with an arrogance that made my skin crawl, uninvited, unwelcome, yet somehow acting like he belonged there. What struck me most wasn't their presence, but their complete absence of joy. While other parents dabbed at their eyes with tissues and beamed with pride, while friends leaned forward in their seats to catch every word of our vows, these 3 sat motionless as statues. They weren't smiling at my happiness. They weren't shedding the bittersweet tears that parents cry when their children reach life's milestones. Instead, they wore expressions I recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with the October AI. Those cold, calculating looks from my childhood that always preceded some form of punishment or manipulation. It was the same face my father would make when he discovered I'd gotten a B instead of an A. The same expression my mother would wear before launching into a lecture about how I'd embarrass the family. Predatory, patient, planning something that would hurt. Throughout the vows, I kept glancing back at them. Mason was taking pictures, but not the joyful kind that wedding guests usually take. He was being methodical, professional, like he was documenting evidence rather than celebrating. And that wooden box my father held? He kept one hand on it at all times, like it contained something precious and dangerous. The reception should have been my chance to bridge the 3-year gap. To finally have that awkward but necessary conversation about rebuilding our relationship. I was naive enough to believe that seeing me genuinely happy might soften their hearts, that witnessing Daniel's obvious devotion might convince them I'd made the right choice after all. But every attempt I made to approach their table met with masterful evasion tactics that would have impressed a spy novelist. The moment I'd excuse myself from conversations with other guests and begin moving in their direction, it was as if they had some invisible early warning system. Gregory would suddenly develop an urgent need to inspect the floral arrangements in the lobby. Linda would remember she'd left something crucial in their car. Mason would announce he needed to step outside for better lighting for his mysterious photography project. Their timing was so precise, so obviously coordinated, that it transcended mere coincidence and entered the realm of calculated strategy. Meanwhile, the questions from my genuine guests grew increasingly uncomfortable to deflect. My college friends cornered me near the dessert table, curiosity evident in their voices as they asked about the serious guy with all the camera equipment who keeps taking pictures but never smiles. Daniel's elderly aunt pulled me aside with grandmotherly concern, wondering aloud why my parents looked like they were attending a funeral instead of celebrating their daughter's marriage. Even the wedding photographer noticed, asking if there was some family tension he should be aware of to avoid capturing awkward moments. "They're probably just nervous," I kept telling everyone. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. This is awkward for all of us." But deep down, a familiar dread was building in my stomach. The same feeling I used to get as a child when I knew I was about to be punished for something I didn't understand. The same feeling I'd lived with for 4 years while dating Mason. Like I was constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next emotional explosion. I was talking to my college roommates near the bar when I heard my father's voice boom across the reception hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The room fell silent. Gregory Carter stood near the head table, holding a microphone he'd somehow acquired from the DJ. Linda stood beside him, clutching that mysterious wooden box. Mason lingered a few feet away, his camera ready, wearing a smirk that made my blood run cold. "I'm Gregory Carter, father of the bride," he announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had terrified me as a child. "I know it's unusual for the father to speak without being invited, but I have something very important to share with all of you today." Daniel immediately started moving toward them, but Gregory raised his hand. "Please, son, let me finish. This concerns you too." I felt frozen in place, surrounded by 150 wedding guests who were now staring at this unexpected drama unfolding. My mouth went dry. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "You see," Gregory continued, "my daughter Amelia has always been, let's say, prone to making impulsive decisions. She has a tendency to run away from things when they get difficult, to abandon people who love her, and to burn bridges instead of working through problems." Murmurs started rippling through the crowd. Some guests looked confused, others uncomfortable. My college friends were shooting me concerned glances, but I still couldn't move. Linda stepped forward, her voice sickeningly sweet. "We've brought something special today, a reminder of who Amelia really is, underneath all this." She gestured vaguely at my wedding dress. Pretense. She opened the wooden box with dramatic flair. Inside, visible to everyone in the front rows, were photographs, letters, and what looked like pages torn from a diary. My diary. "From when I was dating Mason, these are love letters," Linda announced, pulling out handwritten pages, written by Mason Lee, a wonderful young man who loved our daughter with his whole heart. "And these," she held up printed photos, "are pictures of happier times, when Amelia was still capable of real love, before she became so selfish and cold." The room was dead silent now. I could feel 150 pairs of eyes on me, watching this public humiliation unfold. Some guests looked horrified by what my parents were doing. Others seemed fascinated by the drama. But all I could focus on was Mason, standing there with his camera, documenting every moment of my mortification. Gregory took back the microphone. "Mason has something he'd like to say." Mason stepped forward. And suddenly I was 25 again, trapped in that apartment, listening to him explain why his cheating was actually my fault. Why I was too sensitive. Why I should be grateful he stayed with me at all. "Amelia," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I never stopped loving you. I made mistakes, yes, but you ran away instead of fighting for us. You threw away 4 years together because you couldn't forgive one moment of weakness." He paused, looking directly at Daniel. "And now you're marrying this man, this stranger, without even trying to repair what we had. Your parents called me because they're worried about you. They know you're making another impulsive decision, marrying someone you barely know despite the family that loves you." Linda nodded tearfully. "We just want you to be happy, sweetheart. But you keep running from real love. Mason is here because he wants to fight for you, even after all this time." The manipulation was so familiar, so perfectly executed, that for a moment I felt myself slipping back into old patterns. The guilt, the doubt, the feeling that maybe I really was the problem, maybe I really was selfish for leaving, maybe I really was making another mistake. But then I looked at Daniel, my kind, gentle Daniel, who was staring at my parents and Mason with an expression of complete disgust. Daniel, who had spent 2 years showing me what real love looked like, who had never once made me feel guilty for my past, never tried to control me, never made me question my own reality, and suddenly, something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped into place. Like a puzzle piece finally finding its correct position. I walked to the microphone. Gregory tried to hand it to Mason, but I took it from him instead. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "You want to know who I really am?" I said, looking out at the crowd of people I cared about. "Let me tell you who I really am." I turned to face my parents and Mason directly. I am a woman who spent 4 years being emotionally abused by a man who cheated on me repeatedly and convinced me it was my fault. I am a daughter whose parents valued their reputation more than her well-being. When I found out Mason was sleeping with 3 other women, do you know what my father said to me? Gregory's face was turning red. "Amelia, stop this," he said. "Boys will be boys, but good women forgive." When I showed my mother photographs of Mason with another woman, do you know what she said? She said, "You must have driven him to it somehow." The crowd was completely silent now, but I could see expressions changing. The confusion was turning to understanding, the curiosity to concern. "These people," I continued, gesturing to Gregory, Linda, and Mason, "spent months trying to convince me that being cheated on was my fault. That wanting to leave an abusive relationship made me selfish. That expecting basic respect and fidelity made me unreasonable." Linda tried to interrupt. "Sweetheart, you're being dramatic. Am I?" I pulled out my phone, because I have text messages from Mason threatening to kill himself if I left him. I have voicemails from my father calling me ungrateful and worthless when I finally moved out. I have emails from my mother saying I was a disappointment to the family name. I looked back at the crowd. They're here today, on my wedding day, not to celebrate my happiness but to humiliate me, to convince you all that I'm unstable, that my husband doesn't really know me, that I can't be trusted to make my own decisions. Mason stepped forward. "Amelia, you're twisting everything. Am I twisting the part where you slept with my college roommate? Or the part where you convinced me it was my fault for not being exciting enough in bed? Am I twisting the part where you drained my savings account to pay for your photography equipment? Or the part where you told me I was lucky you stayed with me because no one else would want me?" The reception hall was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Mason's confident smirk was gone. Gregory looked like he wanted to disappear. Linda was clutching her purse like a shield. But I wasn't done. "You want to know what real love looks like?" I said, reaching for Daniel's hand. "Real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Real love doesn't make you question your own sanity. Real love doesn't show up at your wedding with a box full of your personal belongings to humiliate you in front of everyone you care about." Daniel squeezed my hand and took the microphone. "I've heard every story about what these people put my wife through," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've held her while she cried about the damage they did to her self-worth. I've watched her work for 3 years to rebuild her confidence and learn to trust again." He looked directly at Gregory. "The fact that you would come here today, to our wedding, and try to destroy her happiness one more time tells me everything I need to know about your character." The crowd began to murmur, and not in support of my parents. I could hear people saying things like, "This is disgusting, and how could they do this to their own daughter?" Several guests were already standing up, ready to intervene. My Uncle Robert, my father's own brother, stood up from his table. "Gregory, Linda, I think you need to leave. Now." Other family members began standing too. My cousins, my grandmother, even some of my parents' old friends who had witnessed years of their controlling behavior. Mason made one last desperate attempt. "Amelia, please. Don't let them turn you against me. You know what we had was real." "What we had," I said, taking the microphone back, "was 4 years of you systematically destroying my self-esteem so I'd be too broken to leave you. What we had was emotional abuse wrapped up in pretty words and false promises." I looked around the room at all the people who had come to celebrate Daniel and me, my real family, my chosen family. "I want everyone here to understand something," I said. "For 26 years these people convinced me that I was difficult, dramatic, and unworthy of love. It took me 3 years of therapy and the love of a good man to realize that the problem was never me." Security had arrived. Daniel had quietly signaled them during my speech. 2 uniformed guards were standing near the exit, waiting for direction. Mom, Dad, Mason, I said, looking at each of them in turn. You are no longer welcome at my wedding, and you are no longer welcome in my life. The fact that you thought this public humiliation would somehow win me back just proves that you never understood me at all. The security guard stepped forward, but Gregory held up his hand. We're leaving, he said, his voice defeated. But don't come crawling back to us when this marriage falls apart too. It won't, I said simply, because it's built on love and respect, not control and manipulation. As they walked toward the exit, Linda turned back one more time. You'll regret this, Amelia. Family is family. You can't just throw us away. I'm not throwing you away, I replied. I'm choosing to protect myself from people who hurt me. There's a difference. The three of them left in disgrace, still carrying that wooden box of my personal belongings that they'd somehow kept for 3 years just for this moment. As soon as they were gone, the entire reception hall erupted in applause. My grandmother came up to hug me, tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. I should have said something years ago about how they treated you. One by one, family members and friends approached to offer support and share their own stories about my parents' controlling behavior that they'd witnessed over the years. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had seen their true nature, but I was the first one brave enough to call it out publicly. The DJ started the music again, and slowly, the reception returned to a celebration, but it felt different now. Lighter, more authentic. Instead of the polite, formal affair I'd planned, it became a real party filled with people who genuinely loved and supported us. Daniel and I had our first dance to At Last by Etta James, and as he spun me around the dance floor, I felt truly free for the first time in my life. The weight I'd been carrying for 29 years, the constant fear that I wasn't good enough, that I was too difficult to love, that I was always one mistake away from being abandoned, was finally gone. I'm sorry that happened, Daniel murmured in my ear as we swayed together. Don't be, I said. They gave me the greatest wedding gift they could have given me, the chance to finally stand up to them in front of everyone who matters to me. Later that night, after the last guest had left and we were alone in our hotel suite, Daniel asked me if I regretted inviting them. No, I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. I needed that closure. I needed to prove to myself that I could face them and not crumble. I needed everyone who loves me to see exactly who they are, so I never have to explain or justify cutting them out of my life again. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages from friends and family expressing their support and sharing their own experiences with toxic relatives. My college roommate, the one Mason had cheated with, who I'd lost touch with afterward, even reached out to apologize and confirm that Mason had pursued her aggressively, telling her that I was practically broken up anyway. But the most meaningful message came from my 16-year-old cousin Emma. Watching you stand up to Uncle Gregory and Aunt Linda yesterday gave me the courage to tell my parents about how my boyfriend has been treating me. Thank you for showing me what self-respect looks like. 3 months later, I learned through family gossip that Mason's photography business had completely collapsed after several of his clients found out about his history of emotional abuse. Apparently, I wasn't his only victim, and my public confrontation had given other women the courage to speak out about their experiences with him. Gregory and Linda became social pariahs in their small community, with several family friends cutting ties with them after witnessing their behavior at my wedding. I didn't feel vengeful about their downfall, I felt peaceful. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it just looks like truth being spoken loudly enough that it can't be ignored anymore. Daniel and I celebrated our first wedding anniversary with a small dinner party at our new house, surrounded by the people who had supported us from the beginning. As I looked around the table at our chosen family, friends who had become siblings, mentors who had become parent figures, and Daniel's kind, loving parents who welcomed me with open arms, I realized something profound. I used to think that cutting off my biological family made me broken or damaged. But sitting there, surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I am, I understood that I hadn't lost a family at all. I'd simply made room for a better one. The little girl who used to lie awake at night wondering why she could never make her parents happy was finally at peace. Not because I'd won some battle against them, but because I'd stopped fighting for their approval and started fighting for my own well-being instead. And that wooden box they brought to humiliate me? It represented everything I'd left behind. The version of myself who believed their lies, who accepted crumbs and called it love, who thought being difficult to abandon was the same thing as being loved. I'm 30 now, with a daughter on the way, and a husband who thinks I'm wonderful exactly as I am. My parents have never met their granddaughter, and they never will, not because I'm cruel, but because I've learned that love isn't something you owe to people just because you share DNA. Real love is something you choose to give to people who cherish it, protect it, and give it back to you in equal measure. The last thing my mother said to me at my wedding was, "You can't just throw us away." But she was wrong about that, just like she'd been wrong about everything else. I didn't throw them away, I set them down. I stopped carrying the weight of their dysfunction and their need to control me. I stopped accepting responsibility for their emotions and their choices. And in setting them down, I picked up something much more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that I am worthy of love, respect, and happiness, exactly as I am. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge or drama or even forgiveness, but simply the quiet, revolutionary act of a woman who finally learned to love herself enough to demand better. That wooden box is probably sitting in their attic somewhere, full of artifacts from a version of me that no longer exists. And I hope it stays there forever. A monument to the woman I used to be, and proof of how far I've traveled to become the woman I was always meant to be.